policy, popular education, and coalition building. Our work is organized around three programmatic areas, namely alternatives to extractivism and climate change, economic justice, and building counterpower. One of the key focuses as the economic justice program is corporate accountability. And our work is rolled out through sort of two kind of spheres. Firstly, through the Southern African campaign to dismantle corporate power, and our advocacy work around halting capital flight, transfer mispricing, and base erosion profit shifting. Our point of departure in relation to this work is to strengthen popular movements to play an autonomous role in campaigning and mobilizing for a wage-led, low-carbon development path. So basically, the ADC's mission is to push for a just transition to a wage-led, low-carbon development path that is the ADC's mission is to push for a just transition to a wage-led, low-carbon development path that moves away from it being heavily centered around corporations and to hold corporations and state institutions accountable. So that's that about the ADC. If you want more, I could have went on for like an hour or two. You do great work, but I tried to summarize it. So I just like to introduce the first session. So the first session today is about contextualizing illicit financial flows and base erosion and profit shifting. So our two speakers will be James S. Henry and David Oberko. Daniel Oberko. James S. Henry is an investigative journalist, a lawyer, an American economist, and a lecturer at Yale. And Daniel Oberko is part of the Public Services International Global Union Federation. Okay. If you could please would be going first? Doesn't matter. Okay, so while you're trying to figure out who's going first, cool. So according to the program, our schedule is 1 hour 30 minutes. So how it's going to work is that each speaker will have sort of run about 25 to 30 minutes to sort of speak, and then we'll have a very vibrant and robust discussion. So it's not a question and answer period, but it's much more for us to collectively think and ponder on the different issues that the comments have put forth. And then after that, sort of after the robust discussion, we'll ask them the speakers to sort of close. So, you go first.
Morning. Thank you very much. As mentioned, I'm Oberko Daniel. I work with this PSI as a tax justice organizer. And this is not the first time I've been here to organize such meetings or to be part of such meetings. I think since 2016, we've been here to organize such meetings with some of the PSI affiliates in South Africa. I think over the years we've worked in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Tanzania, in Kenya. And what we are working to do, or what we seek to do, is to get workers to be part of the campaign. But over the years, we've seen civil society organizations leading the campaign. And I think as rightly been said by both Kia and Dominic, that it's for workers, this is a wage issue. And if funds are moving from our country to tax havens, basically wages are moving. Because if you are negotiating for wages and you are told that the company is making losses, there's need to find out where the profits are really going. So if they are moving out of our country, then basically it means that our wages are also moving out of our countries. I think it's on this basis that we are very much interested in getting workers to be part of the campaign. And apart from that, we appreciate the power workers have, the power workers can bring to the table to shift the policy direction, to shift the understanding of citizens as far as issues of illicit financial flows is concerned. concerned. I just want to touch on the issue of corporate tax raised to the bottom and falling real wages. Before that, give me the opportunity to once again introduce PSI. PSI organizes public sector workers in various countries. So far, we're in about 163 countries with 700 affiliates. In Africa alone, we are in about 42 countries, and we are organizing more than 100 affiliates. So we can spend time maybe after this session to talk more. First of all, I just want us to put the discussion first in the perspective of the worker. And the first understanding is that we have seen science and technology and then globalization, bringing all forms of innovation and development and increasing production, bringing innovation in science and technology, changing how work is done, and the rest. And with this development, we have seen that more and more profit is being made. So 10, 20, 30 years ago, how much profit was made with one production has changed. And so if corporations spent just an hour in making a billion profits, maybe 20, 30 years ago, now with 30 minutes or less, they can make more. And what our concern is that whereas we've seen these profits being made, causing massive changes with GDP numbers, inflation numbers, economic development numbers, and the rest. What we are constantly seeing is one, a reduction in the working conditions of workers, and a reduction in wages as well. So whereas we are seeing a lot of profits being made, we are unfortunately seeing a decline in how this translates into the life of working people and translates into the life of citizens. That is how come we are seeing massive inequality, day in and day out, poverty increasing. And then just this morning we were discussing about issues on food security. That is not that we don't have enough, but just that we have a challenge with distribution. And is it that we can't pay for distribution? Is another thing we need to discuss. So I think that we are seeing development on one side and a massive reduction in the quality of life, real wages, living conditions of workers. That is one perspective. The other one is the fact that whereas corporations are making huge profits, the huge profits are stashed in tax havens. So a work was done by the Institute for Tax on Economic Policy in America. And then what they found out was that they considered the Fortune 500 companies, your Apple, your Google, your Microsoft, your ExxonMobil, your Shell, and all these big multinational companies. And they realized that just in 2016 alone, $2.6 trillion was stashed in tax havens. $2.6 trillion in 2016. So we've seen these corporations make huge profits, but majority of their profits stashed in tax havens. So what is happening is that they are preventing countries from placing tax liabilities on these profits. It goes to respond to why we'll constantly have challenges when it comes to wage negotiation and the rest. As we are speaking now, I'm sure some of you are aware, Nigeria, workers in Nigeria are on strike just to be able to get a national minimum wage. Okay. Now it's interesting, and I chanced on a report by the Financial Times, and one of the data they considered was data that has been collected by KPMG. It considered global tax on wages. It considered global tax rates wages of OECD countries, and then considered wages of some EU countries. Now, what was realized was that since the financial crisis 2017-2018, there has been, on average, a decline in taxation. On the other hand, within that same period, there has been an increase of about 5% increase in the personal income tax. So whereas there's the normal expectation is that we are in crisis, and so we need to find ways of cushioning workers. We need to find ways of cushioning, income of workers or wages of workers. We have seen rather are very telling. They mean a lot to workers. And for us, one of the reasons why we want to engage this is the fact that what these numbers mean is one, poor conditions of workers and low wages. That is one. The other thing is poor health facilities. It's shocking to know that Ghana has about 26, 27 million population. We have just 55 public ambulances. This is aside the numerous challenges women face when they go to the maternity ward, aside the numerous challenges when accident patients go through when they visit the hospital. So I was discussing with one of my colleagues who normally works with unions in Liberia, and she said, I think you shouldn't cry so much because Liberia has just one public ambulance, just one. Just one. So, just one. Liberia is about 6 million. Just one public ambulance. You can find out if you have colleagues in Liberia, you can just text them and discuss with them. Just one. Now, apart from that, Liberia is one country that is, I don't know whether it's working to privatize universal, basic, free education. And I think that we are linking this to some of, to the outflows, because when you engage government, when you engage, the employer, the number one discussion or the number one language or mantra is that we don't have funds. So while these funds are moving out, basically what we are doing is we are depriving our schools, we are depriving our hospitals, we are depriving workers. We are working hard to unfortunately, reduce wages and the strength of our currency. So I was discussing with a colleague, and we're trying to compare 5-10 years ago how much it cost a young person like myself to rent a room, like just one bedroom with a decent toilet and bath and a small kitchen. Now, if you are working class, if you are working and your wage, you depend on the national minimum wage. What it means is that you live very, very, very far from Accra because your wage cannot support accommodation in Accra in the city. You can't. If you are what the World Bank will call in the middle class, and the so-called, the expansion of the middle class in Africa, what it means is there's a type of accommodation in Accra or in Ghana we call chamber and hall. So you have just one bedroom and then one hall with someone, with a small toilet and a small, kitchen. So that one is created for you. And unfortunately, if you are that class, that is the kind of house you'll be able to rent in the city. Because how much you earn will not be enough to arrange for you decent housing. So I know that it's not only in Ghana. So gradually we are having more and more young people who at the age of 35, 40, still with parents, because it doesn't really make sense to not have a job and move out of your parents' home. And I know some who are married, they have a job, are married, but it makes sense to live in your parents' home or to live with your parents, because how much you earn is not enough to be able to rent for you a decent house to live in wife, and probably a kid. So there are harsh realities on the ground that supports the fact that there's need for us to fight illicit financial flows. And for us, it also means constant and massive privatization of public services. And for us, when we discuss privatization, what we are asking is that put the whole agenda or put the whole criteria of privatization on the table. Let's discuss. What does privatizing maybe the energy sector mean? What does it mean in terms of debt to government? What does it mean in terms of subsidies government has to pay to be able to bear some of the cost on pricing? What does it mean to government in terms of guaranteeing loans for these private companies? So a typical example is the water sector in Ghana. So there was a project government launched and it decided to privatize. So government guaranteed supply of energy to the private company, guaranteed management fees, payment of management fees, and then it guaranteed buying off this water from the company and reselling to the public. So what government did was he bought the water at I think $1 or $1.5 per gallon from this company, and then government had to reduce the price because if it sells at the market price, it will be so difficult for the citizens to buy. So for us, one of our discussion or one of our arguments is that if public services are privatized, and what if they are private, what happens is that in the short term, government has no option than to subsidize the price of the goods and services, because the private sector is after his profits and cannot sell at the rate or at the price government was selling before. So government in the short term will subsidize. So what happens is that in the long term, they begin to remove, because subsidizing those items become very unsustainable, and so government has to do well to reduce the subsidies. So that is how come. So in the first few years, okay, we privatize water, and we are selling at we are buying the water sometimes at reduced prices, or maybe the normal price. But in maybe in 5, 10, 15 years, we are going to go back to higher prices, because subsidizing the prices will be so much unsustainable for government. And so for us, these are some of the key areas or some of the few highlights that comes into mind as far as workers are concerned when we discuss illicit financial flows, when we discuss BEPS, when we discuss all forms of illicit financial flows and corruption. There are some few pictures I would like to show, but I think I will give the presentation to Kia for to share. Okay. So on the issue of wages, so I try to look at the national minimum wages of some of the countries, even in West Africa. And like I said, Nigeria currently is on strike. Workers are on strike because they are fighting for the national minimum wage. So if you pick a country like Togo, the monthly minimum wage is about $30. $30. If you pick a country like Ghana, it's about $50, $51. If you pick a country like Nigeria, it's below $60. Now, how do you expect? Of course, this is just the minimum. So some get more than that. But averagely, if you compare how much public sector workers are gaining in these countries, it's less. It's nothing to write home about, considering issues of accommodation, considering issues of fees of children, considering issues of health. And for us, it is time that we mobilize enough workers to join the campaign, because we are certain, we are very much sure that it will take workers' movement to be part of the campaign if you really want to change the discussion, if you really want to change the policies, if we really want to bring everybody on board to bring the kind of change society is looking for. So I think that on this note, I'll leave my discussion here, and then when David continues, we'll have the room, we'll have the opportunity to receive questions and further discussions. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. You've heard of a firm called McKinsey & Company, no doubt. I used to be their chief economist. So that was many years ago. When I worked there, I thought it was a pretty reputable organization, and they were doing good things, basically, and a lot smaller. That was in the 80s. In the last 5 years, when they came to South Africa, they behaved abominably, and they've gotten away with it. So I'm here, first of all, to say to you, I'm sorry. And we have to figure out how to hold these kinds of people responsible. And one of the issues I'd like to add to this discussion is enablers. Because, you know, developing countries have lots of issues internally. Their own institutions are new and are difficult to manage. But they have a whole cast of characters who are outside, in the first world: banks, law firms, accounting firms, consulting firms, that are exploiting the situation and taking advantage of it. They should be here to help. They should be here to improve the quality of life, and they're taking advantage. So one of the issues I want us to highlight here is the role of enablers and what we can do to bring these people to justice. The world is not going to get better on its own. And we have to demand that the first world stops taking our money and stops coming here and bribing in order to clean this up. And the first world, and I think in this case, it also includes countries like China that are extraordinarily powerful and influential here as well, and have not always been behaving much better. I'm going to be talking about something we call the global human industry, because that is the background to this discussion. It's basically a first world-based industry that connects all of the 90 or more havens that are offshore that are laundering money, and many of the onshore havens that have developed. You need to understand this system, because it is a system. It doesn't depend on whether there's a Mauritius or a BVI or a Bahamas or a Cayman Islands or a Guernsey. Any one of these individual havens could go down, disappear from the face of the earth, and the system would anneal. The system would find a way around it. So it's that system that we have to identify as the enemy, because that's the problem that we are all, individual countries are all facing, fighting the problems of kleptocracy and tax evasion and private banking, multinational tax dodging, human capital flight, and the problem of remittances, and finally the representation without taxation, where we see the creation of a global elite that is citizen of nowhere for tax purposes, and yet has extraordinary influence, money and lobbying and bribery and other methods, force necessary to exert their will. Cambridge Analytica is a good example. I was just talking about with my Kenyan colleague from Tax Justice Africa. Cambridge Analytica is a UK-based company. It was funded by American billionaires. They set up ways of designing methods to intervene in elections across borders using manipulations of Facebook data on individuals and targeting people with certain kinds of messages. And in Kenya's case, apparently it was substantial enough to make a difference in the election. I've been studying Donald Trump and his connections to the former Soviet Union, but Cambridge Analytica was also influential in our election in 2016, and it seems to have had an impact on Brexit. This is just an example of a problem that no one country can solve on its own. It is a global problem that we have to deal with across borders in the category of these others. Panama Papers, you probably heard about. 2016, we got a leak from a Panama law firm, Mossack Fonseca, that was servicing this global industry. They're basically providing anonymous companies and trusts, mainly to banks all over the world, but also to law firms. 214,000 offshore companies. We have discovered the identities of the so-called beneficial owners. It's hard to find out who actually owns these anonymous companies and trusts. It's one of the big problems that investigative journalists have, is identifying who owns the money and where they are from, ultimately. And there's very lax disclosure. The OECD, the Organization of Economic Development, which is a kind of coalition of 34 rich countries, has come up with some rules that they would like to apply to this system, requiring beneficial ownership disclosure, but those have not been adopted. My own country, the United States, is one of the leading opponents of transparency in this area. In fact, it has become, if anything, even more secretive than many other offshore havens, to the point where it's now the leading tax haven from the standpoint of financial secrecy for kleptocrats and companies alike. Certainly in the same class as the UK and Switzerland. Anyway, in that revelation, we had, we disclosed that there were 22 heads of state, 150 or so public officials who were disclosed to be owning offshore assets that they hadn't disclosed to their own governments, and they lost their jobs in many cases. But that's just the tip of the iceberg for this industry. That's one firm with 500 employees. And, there's about 2,000 law firms in Panama. I first found Mossack Fonseca in 1987 when I was investigating General Noriega, who was the dictator of Panama. He was involved in money laundering. And they were handling his foreign accounts way back when. So we've known about these problems of offshore secrecy, financial secrecy, and the enablers for decades, and literally done nothing about it. So that's another theme of song. Theme of this message here is we need to finally recognize the existence of this industry and tackle it forcefully. So when I went to, in reaction to the Panama Papers, I was invited to go to Iceland, because Iceland's lost its president and its prime minister to the disclosures in the Panama Papers, because they had offshore accounts that they haven't disclosed. And we audited the top 3 Iceland banks.
What is this?
This is what we found, a matrix of cross-holdings within the Iceland financial system. And Iceland is a country of 300,000 people. And, basically you couldn't tell who owned anything from this audit. It was so complicated. The only way to understand this at all was by looking at it as a network. An incestuous network of interconnected elites, some of whom were domestic, many of whom were from offshore. They were using Iceland as a piggy bank. They had this libertarian philosophy that said we can't regulate our banking system, and so for a decade they let it go, and they ended up in 2008 having all 3 big banks fail because they'd gone into debt. This golden model this golden calf kind of model that they've been pursuing suddenly collapsed. And so only then did we discover that, literally could not regulate their financial system because nobody owned it. No one could figure out who owned it. So that's just one example from the Panama Papers. Now, if we could get information on the offshore companies' ownership in South Africa, you would find a much larger, but probably equally intricate network. So one of my objectives to come here and to talk with you and meet is we need to establish investigative power. In addition to all the great policy analysis we do here, there's an ongoing, never-ending problem of figuring out what's going on and getting whistleblowers to come forward and encouraging whistleblowers to tell the truth about the inside story. Dick has been working with one another, has been very helpful. And just that one case alone will make a huge difference. If you can tell that story and get it known, the success we've had with telling the truth against the united forces of this very powerful global industry that's extremely well funded and has all these interests at stake, the truth can make a difference. And finding out what's really going on, I think, is another critical thing. In addition to the industry perspective, we need the investigative perspective to build our investigative capabilities. Everybody knows somebody who knows something important about this, and you can just get them to talk and help. That's important. Okay, we've had sort of the banality of exposés. We've had a number of these Panama paper type exposés, and it's formed some impressions. We've had one after another. I think it's beginning to sink in that this is a global problem, but we have a long way to go in terms of getting the regulators, many of whom are planning their next move to work in the industry when they leave government, to do anything. The EU just published a list in December of last year, 2017, so-called blacklist of tax havens. And this is an approach that some countries have tried, and it might be one that South Africa could consider, is to identify jurisdictions that are not cooperating with tax authorities. If SARS was a functioning organization and was really doing investigative work, first-rate work, you would have such a blacklist would be a very useful thing to do. But it also is a very political kind of football. And in the case of the EU, you can't really read the names on the left, but I can tell you it's Bahrain, Barbados, Grenada, Macau, Marshall Islands, a lot of little countries. None of these are the key players in the global haven industry, and they don't include any EU havens. And they, by March, they had already revised and moved most of these countries to the blacklist anyway, and they were left with even more, even less significant players, like Namibia was on the list, Palau, tiny island that's facing global warming. So on the other hand, we all know from our analysis and the work that I've done with Tax Justice Network and global economists on these issues, in terms of the sheer volume of assets that they manage, in terms of their influence on the industry, in terms of the role of the banks, law firms, and accounting firms that are based in these places, it's Switzerland, it's the US, and it's the spider networks managed out of the UK, including all of their international Commonwealth countries and dependencies, countries like Bermuda and BVI and Cayman Islands, part of that network. Those are the real havens, those destination havens. Nobody wants to keep their money in the British Virgin Islands. It's tiny, there's nothing to invest in. But if you really want your assets hidden safely, securely, you move them to New York or Miami or London or Zurich, where they have a tax system that's very kind to non-domicile people, non-resident aliens is the term involved. Basically tax-free. So if they can fall between the cracks, they'll be citizens of nowhere for tax purposes. These are the real problem countries. And we have to keep that in mind when we understand the structure of the enemy and who is really in the background driving the system. The network operators, the systems operators for the global haven industry. This system, when I started studying this in the 70s, had 15 players offshore. Today, there's more than 110 financial secrecy jurisdictions. And it's just grown up even though we've known about it. And the reason is that, not because it has objective value to provide that we couldn't do without, but because there's very powerful interests at stake in driving it. It's a global industry that serves not just tax dodging, which is what we often talk about. We talk and describe these places as tax havens. Well, they're much more than tax havens. They're helping kleptocrats, people who are stealing money from the treasury. You know, Dubai, I think you're familiar with their role in Zoom against transnational criminals for using these places for money laundering and contraband. The subject of odious privatizations, odious debt, odious finance in general, where underregulated jurisdictions are abusing their authority to issue paper and you know, becoming parking lots for all kinds of underregulated financial activity. And finally, the political influence, the globalization of political intervention. It's a real fundamental threat to democracy that we're seeing right now. This is like the Star Wars bar scene. I don't know if you've seen Star Wars, the movie, but remember the scene where they had all these crooks from different kinds of backgrounds, and one was sitting in the, was sitting in the corner, and they're all sitting around this very same table, sharing these facilities: financial secrecy, under-regulation, under-taxation, and the existence of these very sophisticated enablers. This is not an industry that is, you know, self-organizing. I mean, it's not something you do for yourself to set up a company in Mauritius with subsidiaries all over the place. It requires enablers. One of the schemes I'll go into a little bit later if we have time is one that was brought to South Africa by Morgan Stanley in the last 5 years, sheltering the incomes and wealth of one of the richest people in South Africa. This scheme was devised by accountants who are here, but this international investment bank basically sold it as a play to this wealthy investor. It involved 18 offshore companies. You know, 3 in Mauritius, 1 in Namibia, because you have a foreign exchange rate zone within Namibia that's easily exploited. And it was generating phony, fundamentally fraudulent tax returns. If SARS were a going institution, if it were really capable of bringing cases, they would have prosecuted Morgan Stanley for tax fraud. You know, it would have been worth billions to the country. So there's an example of where we need investigations, we need prosecutions, we need law enforcement, in addition to all the other policies that we talk about with respect to so-called controlling international financial flows and base erosion. Oh, the other point about these places is that they all have the rule of law. The reason the kleptocrat from Russia, Victor Vekselberg, wants to hold his assets in Zug is because in addition to everything else Zug has, and mountains and skiing and opera and other things, amenities, they have courts, they have Swiss officials who don't take bribes. They can be relied on to defend the rights of the kleptocrats who manage to steal their money and bring it to Switzerland. So the irony is that they exploit the legal system to the extent that you know, there is a legal system in Switzerland. You can describe it as a system for the rich. If you're rich enough, you can do what you'd like there, but it is still a case of ultimate hypocrisy. So we've seen that there's a kind of a mythology about the so-called offshore tax haven industry. First of all, it's not about just tax. Secondly, it's an old story. It's not a new story, even though it's received a lot more attention in the last few years. It's not strictly offshore. I mean, there's 49 U.S. states that will now sell you secret company. There's no beneficial ownership registration for who owns those companies. Nevada, Delaware. There's 13 U.S. states that will sell you so-called asset protection trusts that are set up to help you hide assets and manage them. They're just as good as anything you can find in the Channel Islands or the Cook Islands. So it's an onshore industry. It's become onshore. It's not legal. I mean, one of the classic defenses you find for this system is that, oh, well, everything we're doing is legal. But, you know, the best response to that is that these people are making laws in many cases. And secondly, when they determine what's legal, I know a big accounting firm in the UK, if you have a tax structure and they're trying to tell you whether it's something that you as a corporation can rely on, they will let you go forward and implement it, report it to the authorities, if it has a 25% chance of passing an audit. That's their definition of legal. So you can see that it's the definition of legality is, as Dennis Healy once said, that the difference between legal and illegal is the width of the prison wall. You know, there's just too much in this tax area, in this kleptocracy area. Whether something is legal or not is really complicated. It's certainly no excuse for doing things that are immoral and wrong. And so these are supposed to be professions that we're dealing with. They don't behave as if they were professional. So what do we know about the payment industry? I don't have time to go into each one of these topics in the detail that we would love to take, but I'll summarize some of the headlines. We've seen the globalization of organized crime. I've spent a lot of time recently studying the Russian mafia and the Trump organization and their connections. That's my latest thing. But you know, that's a global phenomenon that's exploiting these havens as well. You have that problem in South Africa as well. Money laundering is a big part of that. Odious finance, you know, kleptocracy, we find, is actually, for many developing countries, more important than tax dodging in terms of explaining the offshore wealth. There's about $14 trillion offshore from the developing world. Much of the money comes from countries that really don't have effective taxation. The largest are China and Russia. Russia has about $1.3 trillion offshore belonging to Russian citizens. Because people take their money out to protect themselves from the lack of law in Russia. Pirate banking is this business of managing offshore wealth, more than 25 trillion as of 2014. It's continued to grow since then. Represents a loss of maybe $300 to $500 billion a year of tax revenue. It's owned by the top 0.1% of the planet, of people on the planet, about a total of about 8 million people own all of it, all the offshore wealth. That has a big impact on our measures of inequality. And it's been administered by the largest banks on the planet. I can go into that in a lot of detail. In the last decade, they not only got bailed out by U.S. governments, by major Western governments around the planet, but they also proceeded to go deeply into the business of facilitating global tax dodging and a bunch of other crimes. Top 22 banks in the world have paid about $300 billion of fines since 2000. They committed 750 felonies. None of the executives in those banks went to jail, and you know, their behavior hasn't changed. I mean, the way we penalize banks for misbehavior, the way we penalize corporate executives for misbehavior, is another theme here, another policy instrument that we need to be aware of, because the existing system doesn't really effectively change the institutional behavior of major corporations and banks. They get caught time and time again. And it takes so long to enforce the financial laws against their financial crimes that on a, strictly speaking, a business net present value model, if you're familiar with financial valuation, they make the profits early from this exercise, and then it takes 8 to 10 years to bring them to jail or to bring them to court. and at the end of the day, they've made the money up front, and then if they ever get caught and they pay the fine, it will be years down the road. So it just takes too long to bring white-collar criminals to justice. Multinational tax competition, I want to go into in more detail. I'll hold that thought, but that's worth another $200 billion. It's very important in countries like South Africa. Human capital flight is the issue of the fact that we have the poorest people on the planet, in many cases, leaving their countries, going to places like the US, sending money back home to their relatives in source countries. And South Africa has quite a few guest workers here as well who are sending money home. When they do that, they're often subject to a private tax. Western Union, if you're sending $100 to Haiti, will charge about 15 cents on the dollar to get the $100 to Haiti. So in the case of Haiti, they have about a third of their whole GDP is based on remittances. Worldwide, this number is $650 billion in remittances sent by the poorest workers on the planet back to their relatives. And they're paying this exorbitant tax to the private sector, to Western Union, MoneyGram, and other exchange operators. So if you simply get rid of that tax or reduce it to a more reasonable level, like 1%, using new technology, that would be an enormous value creation right away. But again, there are powerful interests in exploiting that. Let me jump to here's some of the kleptocrats I've investigated around the planet. And the patterns are pretty similar in many cases. The puzzle I was looking at in the case of third world debt and kleptocracy was the question of where the money went. Because between 1970 and 2003, the developing world example, $6.8 trillion ever before the financial system, including about $3 trillion of foreign debt. But at the same time, you saw growth rates decline. So it's a fundamental puzzle that most economists didn't bother to look at. Why do we have a decline in growth during this period when we had all this capital coming in? But capital coming in doesn't necessarily guarantee anything in terms of growth rates, unless the funds are well managed. And in this case, at the end of the day, we did have some debt forgiveness at the end of everything. I have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to have to rush this. Net, we only forgave about 10 cents on the dollar of all that wasted debt. Much of it went into places like in the case of the Philippines, where we have, auditing the central bank of the Philippines, we found that Marcos had used it as his piggyback, basically, borrowing $8 billion from US banks, sending it offshore to Switzerland immediately. Philippines getting stuck with the debts, and the Philippines not having anything to show for that borrowing, and Marcos walking away with the money. Philippines could have contested that and said, this is odious debt, there's nothing to show for it. A dictator borrowed it under US law, which we have used in the 1890s against Spain. There's an odious debt doctrine. So if you can show that money was stolen by a dictator, the country doesn't have to pay it back. But the Philippines was so intimidated by the international banks that they never prosecuted this odious debt doctrine. Marcos ended up, that was his main source of foreign wealth. You have a neighbor right next door who's done a similar thing. Before he left power, Dos Santos put his son in charge of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And he set aside $5 billion to the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Angola. And then with the help of this fine fellow from Switzerland, Oscars, they proceeded to loot this $5 billion fund. This is a case that's still going on now. I was working on this last year. But these people are going to be prosecuted, I hope, for essentially stealing public assets. But this is an example of so-called legal capital flight, where you had the government of Angola essentially setting up this arrangement for insiders to profit. So that's another example of kleptocracy. In the case of privatizations, we've seen many cases, as my friend here described, of odious privatizations. Russia is the best example, where they privatized 150,000 state companies in the 90s for a grand total of $9.7 billion, most of which was loaned to the oligarchs who acquired most of the Russian economy by the World Bank and the IMF. They selected these people to be in the loans for shares program, and they walked away with the country. We complain a lot about Putin, but we got to understand where Putin came from. You know, the 90s in Russia were no picnic, and we basically mismanaged that whole transition to democracy, and awarded most of the wealth in the country to a tiny group that then took their money out and financed Donald Trump. So the offshore industry here, I'm just about out of time, but I want to hit you with two more slides about the tax system here. What are we getting at when we're talking about the international tax reform and BEPS? We've all eaten bananas, so I wanted to just describe one example of what Chiquita Bananas does with the Chiquita, is one of the pretty big banana suppliers in the world, does with the global tax system and the offshore haven industry when it comes to banana reducing taxes. Basically, they set up a chain of subsidiaries in the haven countries all over the world. Each one would charge the parent a fee for so-called services. Cayman Islands, 12 cents per pound for purchasing, 12 cents for financial services. Ireland, 6 cents for the brand. Isle of Man. There's almost no haven left out. Bermuda and so forth and so on. By the time it reaches the UK, the internal captive companies have absorbed all of the profits. There's almost no tax levied on the banana chain because they've used this international system of captive companies to drain all of the intermediate profits away from the system. We see similar things going on with trade with Zambia and Switzerland. I can be happy to talk to the Swiss role in the world is basically to park money. If you look at Zambia's copper exports, you see Zambia reports most of them as going to Switzerland. Switzerland doesn't report any imports of copper from Zambia because all the Swiss companies have done, in this case Glencore, have parked the profits offshore in the BDI and are avoiding tax. So Switzerland does that all over the planet with commodity exporters from many countries, including South Africa. Let me describe one final thing. We have a real challenge on our hands, which is that the U.S. has recently become the most aggressive tax cutter in the global corporate tax system. The tax reform that was passed last year by the Trump administration and Congress, Republican Congress, basically provided a kind of $800 billion gift to the largest companies in the United States because it allowed them to get away with paying less than 1% effective tax on their $2.6 trillion offshore. And it also reduced the U.S. tax to one of the lowest rates in the OECD. Now the United States is down next to Latvia in terms of having a 21% tax rate going forward, and also this is a territorial income tax. So this is stimulating an enormous amount of tax reduction on the part of other countries. Australia has already got a bill to reduce their corporate income tax. South Korea is considering it. European countries are looking at the same issue. It's a big problem for the OECD, but it's especially important this reduction in corporate tax rates has been going on since Reagan during the 1980s. Reagan and Thatcher were the first to conduct this race to the bottom. It's important for first world countries, but the U.S. only collects about 8% of its tax revenue from the corporate income tax. Germany collects only about 4.7%. So it's a relatively small fraction of their revenue system. Developing countries like South Africa, you collect about 19% of your tax revenue from the corporate income tax, and it's only, it's a key part of your financing struggle. If you're going to avoid the debt problem, if you're going to minimize it, you have to strengthen the corporate tax system here, not run away from it. And other developing countries are the same situation, much more reliant on corporate income tax because it's an easier and more efficient tax for developing countries than many alternatives. The alternative is debt. South Africa's debt ratio is already rising. Or it's VAT taxes, sales tax. You've already raised your VAT tax substantially. That's a regressive tax that hits ordinary people. So unless we figure out the corporate income tax, we're going to have a hard time avoiding these regressive taxes. And I would also suggest, and this is, I'm way out of the depth here, but we have a couple experts in the room who joined us if you want to know more about this. The land issue in South Africa is Ramaphosa is talking about it, and Trump is talking about it. It is obviously a serious question for the next, at least through the election next year. My own preference would be to think seriously about the alternative of just collecting a corporate tax on the big white farms. And forget about whether they're using water or land or electricity or whatever factors of production are involved, but allowing the country to collect effective taxation from these farms. It's surprising how little we actually know about the farm sector in terms of value. How much is it worth? How much income are they generating? And one of the first things we could ask STARS to do is to produce some income for that sector, produce some data on the income generated by the large farms in South Africa. And let's see whether they're paying taxes. We don't know. Nobody knows. A lot of the holdings are murky. They're in companies and trusts. The data on actual land ownership is poor. And so I think it's a real opportunity to take on maybe not an alternative to land reform. I think there are fundamental kinds of issues that you can't get at unless you do have land reform. But tax should definitely be a weapon that you should consider when you're working for social justice with respect to agriculture. And it hasn't been to now. I'm going to stop there.
So now this is an opportunity for us to sort of have a conversation. I was asking that those who would like to say something, please just stand up or just tell us like a brief intro of who you are, and then go ahead and shoot. Yes, sir.
Thanks, man. My name is Godfrey. I'm from NUMSA. The latter speaker, the introvert, I don't think that they understand in terms of our political landscape, where he speaks about the land that we must tax the rich. We should remember that the poor remains poor because they do not have access to the land. And it would be unfair that people from outside our borders would want to tell us how we must craft our own policies in terms of the land. What is quite important is Less the people of the country speaks in terms of what is best for them in terms of land distribution or land acquisition without compensation. Because the very same farmers did not even buy those farms. Now, how do you want us to go and beat those people that stole from us? We are not saying that this are they stole from us, but they are not entitled to all those things. How best can our people work in terms of making sure that they have an access to the land? That is a question that we must talk to. Not you giving us alternative. We are not affected by this thing to come and say your alternative must be A, B, C. It is only us that must be able to begin to say how best to address this question of the land. No one else, because we are the one that are affected. I think that's what I wanted to submit that question. But again, my comrade will also speak in terms of the presentation that have been presented. But when it comes to the question of land, I'm very jealous about that aspect. And we should protect that.
You, sir, and after.
Do I get to respond? I'll respond at some point.
Yeah.
Later.
Rather so that we don't have like a young back and forth.
Yeah, no, I said, I want to yell back and forth.
Drink tea, please.
I appreciate your point.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Dean, for that useful presentation. Just a quick one. The problem with tax service, over the years, is fairly well known. My worry is regarding price. Recently, Kenya passed a law, with the Nairobi International Financial Center. I think if you look at it more incisively, the lesson goes beyond what we are losing. The lesson is kind of, we can't beat them, so let's join them. Because if you look at that law, technically what it says is we want to convert Nairobi into a mini tax haven, And if you look at it historically, when the law was being designed, we had a team of Kenyans, both from the local government and the central government, that had what they were calling a benchmarking experience. And you know where they went for benchmarking? The City of London. So technically, we are recreating, the City of London in the Kenyan context. So I don't know, from your opinion, how can we craft the lessons that we learn from these bad experiences so that we don't repeat the bad things in the African continent just because we can't beat them?
Just a reminder for everyone, please introduce yourselves and you can catch your name.
Sorry, my
Say
name
something
is,
about it.
my name is Mike Otieno from Tax Justice Network.
Thank you.
I'm Juma. I'm a tax practitioner, but also exiled in national trade reviews in the tax area. Firstly, I think that the point that is being made concerning agriculture is that agriculture is tremendously obscured in its ownership, in its tax take, in the way it operates currently relative to the banks and the way it operates currently relative to what we call vertical integration. So when Woolworth says from the field to the shelf, they mean that. And this is not a distinctively South African phenomenon, it's happening all over the world. There's land being bought up on the cheap, people being driven off in Ethiopia for precisely that purpose. So coming back to tax though, and without going into whether one has a reformist agenda or a revolutionary agenda as you propose, the fact of the matter is that if you look at all the schedules to the Income Tax Act in South Africa, they're actually gifts to various sectors. So your Fox schedule is designed for farmers, and you'll be amazed at what you can value sheep at. If you value sheep at 30 rands and you sell them for 2,000 rands, it's hardly something that is so effectively what you have is you have a real fault line developing in the tax system and what the ANC agreed to in 1993 concerning agriculture. The ANC wiped out in one act, not a act of parliament, but one sweep act, which was the adoption of a structural adjustment program. And all that went with it, effectively, it brought to an end the kind of subsidized agriculture. But the tax laws are still very much the obscure tax laws. Then if you look at the the schedule on pension funds. That's a gift to the financial services industry. And then if you look at the schedule or the provisions regarding mining. So if you look at what is happening, I'm not saying that one doesn't have to delve into the technical aspects, but equally we need a helicopter view of the politics involved and the actual practice. And having been in the bowel of the beast, I can tell you now that we need to advocate the net present value or the future value of money for taxation. Because this is the game these gangsters in the banks play. What they do is, as they approach the end of financial year, they see that they're sitting with a tax problem. So they phone up a retailer and they say, we've got tax base, or do you have tax base? They offload by lending them a tremendous amount of money. And retailers make more money lending for the purchase of goods than for actual sale of goods. And they distribute their tax base that way. It takes 2 years and 30 files before the auditors go through the bank's return with lots of toing and throwing of correspondence. They walk you down for another 5 years, they settle at a fraction at the value of the money at that time, and they get away with it. So when I grow up, I want to be a bank. It's as simple as that. This is a very, very lucrative gaming industry. And the worst thing is this, and it's coming out in in the way Johan van Lochenberg and Pete Richer and all of them are talking about their involvement and the rot in SARS. The fact of the matter is that we need to ask ourselves, what are the elements of continuity in this? And the structural elements of continuity are, we've got privacy laws. So we will never know whether Pravin Gordhan wrapped Zuma over the knuckles, or whether he should have nailed him when the judge pronounced as he did in the late 2000s before he became president. We will never know when Johan van Lochenberg says that he was not a police spy, whether he's a police spy or was not, unless we have those records accessible. And this is the problem. The entire tax system is based on secrecy, and it says, no, we don't want people to know what others earn because then they become targets of crime. But the criminality is the other way. On the question of secrecy of jurisdictions, this is something that arose as a result of the inability to physically control under colonialism. And so it moved into a situation where the maxim, do not worry about who writes the laws, just worry about who issues the money, who controls the issuance of money. On the question of the Reserve Bank and strengthening SARS and all of that, we can strengthen SARS to rehabilitate it to what it was, but then we need to structurally ask in the process, what was the limitation of SARS as it was?
My name is Prashni Ganada. I used to be with the labor movement for a very long time, but I'm now on my own, on Spanner. I have two questions. The first one is to Daniel. I see PSI is doing a lot of work on a cross-border basis, and obviously there's a linkage with the public service unions in terms of the impact on public services, but also tax revenue. But what work are you doing with your private sector unions? And particularly because this is where they organize the very companies that are responsible. Also, I mean, I would like your answer to reflect on what's happening with the global North unions and global South unions. Because from my perspective, there may be more unity amongst, subject to correction, your public service unions within the global South and North on this issue. But while our global North unions would want companies to pay more tax within their commissions. So it would be interesting to hear what has been happening in those kind of discussions when you work with global. James, your question relates to, well, it's a critique, and obviously you agree with that this isn't always the process. And a lot of what we can get out of this is limited to the very narrow definition of what is falls within the financial flows. And my concern as well is that even beyond that, the problems with the global South falls, and not just Africa, is very form value chain. And some of that is resource driven, but some of it is just the nature way things are classified. So the fact that intellectual property equity or branding has particular value. I don't think, from my sense, that dealing with questions of misinvoicing or transfer pricing and tax havens or even corporate tax would address that. But maybe you can, you might, it might not be, it might have come later in your presentation, but I would want to know to what extent that could resolve our issues. Because I don't think that, we are, if we can continue with this, where we just have we just focus on more limited focus, that the global south would ever get an adequate deal out of this. And either we go on a process where we follow the OECD process, where we have a narrow focus, or we have a parallel process where we look at a broader framework and how we engage in that.
I'm just gonna let the speakers respond and then we'll take the next sort of round. Is that okay? Starting no.
Yeah, I think we're running a bit behind on time, so maybe just see if there's anyone else wants to contribute to
There's like a few
discussion.
more people, so that's what I'm saying. I think let's get James and Daniel respond and then we'll take it over from there. And comments, just also because of time, our comments and sort of our interventions or questions, can we just limit it? Or just like a young summary of what you're trying to say? If you want to say it, if you want to comment now, okay.
Thank you. Sunita Mani, stars. I just want to provide a little bit of perspective here. I ran the large business center. Included in the large business center tax base was these large corps, as well as the hierarchy. I think it's important to understand when we come to high wealth individuals, a lot of the money that leaves the country actually goes to UK to the crown dependencies and then goes to other destinations. Very difficult to reconcile that because the money is leaving South Africa cannot be reconciled to what's entering the UK. And then you don't know what the other destination is because there's no disclosure. That's one issue. The second issue is that bring them to account unique lifestyle offers. Other countries have inheritance taxes, so they know what assets are sitting with individuals. In South Africa, we have no view of the individual taxpayer and what the assets are comprised of, and therefore you can't reconcile. Yet with the lifestyle offers, you can see, well, this is your standard of living versus these are the assets you have. So there's a gap, account for that gap. I can guarantee you, high wealth individuals at minimum have between 20 to 30 entities linked to them. We saw that complex diagram. As part of our work, we used to look at that diagram and devise that diagram for taxpayers. But the problem is, the high wealth individual needed a strategy. They had less than 10 staff, less than one auditor. How are you going to police everyone? Needed emphasized capability. Agricultural sector, not very much revenue because we have structural limitations in the country. Agriculture, mining, manufacturing. We need to revisit the tax dispensation. Little point in trying to get taxes when actually we're giving a lot of the monies away. One needs to revisit all the tax incentives to see, is it going in the right place? Is it the intention of government to subsidize these industries? You have a problem with what is known as thin capitalization. We had a lot of abuse. We had investments in this country. People came in and we allowed them huge amounts of loan funding in terms from the tax benefit point of view. Most of them actually never turned around and made a profit. So we gave them that refund. We gave them huge tax refunds, tax deductions. They never ended up paying taxes. 5 years down the line, the first is subsidizing it. The average person is subsidizing it. Makes no sense. I'm going to end on this last point. From a wage point of view, I think there's more than just practical action. I have a concern about the sentiment and the philosophy in our country. We need what is known as good corporate citizenship. We need good fiscal citizenship. I've seen situations where employees have kept 2 sets of books, one for the trade union, one for everybody else. That is wrong. I've also seen companies that actually retrench employees and pay the balance of the employees a bonus. How does that make sense in this country where you have such a huge unemployment rate? I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay, but since I guess it's very important, Elizabeth, are you comments fine with all comments and then you also have final remarks at the end? Is that fine?
Sure.
Cool, cool.
Thanks, Chair. I'm Mohan Masood from Costa. I want to share particularly from the last presentation. What is the implication of the minimum restricting structure of global production? Does it mean we must strengthen global regulation and global supervision by the supranational state, that is the AU, the multinational? What does it mean in practical terms? Because production has ceased to be national, which means at the national level, there is difficulty to be able to trace the outflows and the inflows and the exits. So what does it practically mean in the regulation of multinational companies that have become an endless web of networks globally? That's the first one. The second one is that there are primitive forms of accumulation that I'm not sure whether we cited them properly. The Somali case of what is called the pirates. Because what is called the pirates is not just necessarily about crude loom hands who are seizing big machines. It is organized thuggery, it's organized corporate multinational companies that are able to exercise control over the whole Horn of Africa region. The DRC case, particularly the eastern part of the DRC, what does it mean with regard to the fact that the accumulation that's taking place there is outside the works of even the state itself? So I am not sure whether we can be able to relate to both the advanced or sophisticated forms and the most backward, crude, primitive forms of accumulation that take place, where you have a bucket of gold taken over the DRC into Angola and ends up in Cape Town or in Belgium. So all those are forms of looting or thuggery that is outside the most, should I say, they are not necessarily the sophisticated forms of the Panama papers. So the last one that I wanted to check was that, then what is the meaning of the cryptocurrency? Today we have what is called Bitcoin cryptocurrency, and most of the money is made there or even sanitized there. And how do we regulate and how does it relate? Because it also is parasitical into wages, into forms of development, and reinforces underdevelopment.
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Roslan Ndiki. I'm from Lumsa. I think probably to recap, yesterday we actually mentioned that it is critically difficult, very difficult to get any information from the employer. Of course, my participation is based on the fact that I'm a worker in the factory and I've got a boss. Because all this, and this is very complicated for an ordinary worker. An ordinary worker, comrades, to understand his own or her own tax, how it works. It's complicated to understand all of this. It needs a serious training that is repeatedly, that is actually, we try to make it easy for a layman, a lay worker at that level. But having said that, we need to be repeating, hopefully, that we have only one hope as workers, that's Section 16. And that Section 16 cannot assist us to deal with the scourge of this corruption in this level. And probably the one not bigger problem that we might have is actually the stagnation of the trade union sector, because we were saying yesterday, in order for you to be given an opportunity actually to be allowed to even use Section 16, you need to have a majority in the workplace. And without that majority in the workplace, if you are 10 unions in that workplace, you are not actually speaking in one word, and it becomes totally difficult. So in such a way, if we're going to run a campaign, it's going to be a campaign that is not easy at all. Because you can talk, if for instance in this, I don't know how many employers that are here, the employer organizations that do not convince each other very easily to actually accept when the workers make these requests, just to give the workers, even if it's 2 workers or it's 3, because you've got companies, for instance, that are seriously making a huge amount while they're employing all these 6 or 10 workers, besides those big corporates that we almost look at that the unions have not. But over and above the normal companies, we've got the companies like your public companies like your SAA, that's where the corruption is, your Transnet, That's where the most corruption is, the most money is. So when you look at this, I want the comrade Daniel, sorry, forgive me to use comrade word that I don't know what use, Daniel, and said that to help us as to how actually we should approach this at that level, because as a trade union, it's critically difficult for us. What should be our approach? They give us an approach as a trade union. But I wanted to probably, they mentioned some countries, for instance, they mentioned Ghana. I wanted to make comparison between South Africa and Ghana. You know, some of the countries, we've seen our situation have deteriorated over time. Because if you look in Ghana, the side of Iliba, and you see that our people are actually having small businesses themselves. Vis-a-vis the situation of South Africa. In South Africa, there's small businesses even in our communities, but are run by our foreign nationals in our own communities. I'm talking now our participation in economy, over because most of people they get retrenched. After they retrench, they cannot even run a spaza shop. I'm not saying there's anything, but we are unable to compete with our brothers and sisters from Africa in the small business sector. What should be done? Because I'm saying in Ghana, is only people of Ghana who are running those small businesses in their communities, let alone the difference between the one who's staying in Accra and the one who's close to the castle side towards the way the people are doing their fishing and the small businesses and so on.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yes, I'm Nick Forster from AFEC. So, no, we had this discussion yesterday, and when I listened to James and to Daniel and so on, I'm thinking sort of what would be the leverage to really push an alternative political agenda? Sort of how do you sort of, I don't know if James and others are very much involved in lobbying with government and OECD and so on, but I mean, on the one hand, you have these proclamations and the base erosion and profit shifting program of the OECD and others. On the other hand, it's just getting worse and worse. So I'm not acquainted with there must be some kind of faction fight among the elite about this. But it seems like the good elite, if you like, or the more sort of reasonable elite who wants to stop this, they are losing. Isn't it? I mean, now when James speaks about sort of states in another comment spoke about if we are not in Kenya, if we are not able to stop this, let's join it becomes almost like game theory, you know, sort of if you can't stop this avalanche of the looting and tax evasion and tax avoidance and so on, then the alternative is becoming the best financial, the best tax and the best, etc., etc. And so that is why the trade union movement is so important here. It can't be only an NGO issue. And that is why we from AFC have brought up this as a direct thing, as a direct bargaining chip in wage negotiations. When they show in not so usual cases, but when they show the financials, they usually show some financials which is not relevant for this employment, for this company. They show it for the whole public company. They don't show it for the subsidiary where I am employed. So you have to really take the issue of trusts in South Africa. You have thousands of trusts which is absolutely secret, and that was an issue the Rotterdam violence trial. So why is the government not in favor of disclosing? You can forbid the formation of such trusts. You don't allow it. I mean, it will not hurt the real economy. It's just there to hide wealth. So where is the political vehicle for this? And I have had hopes for EFF. I'm not so sure any longer. And luckily, I don't have to vote in the elections, so I don't have to bother with the issue. But yeah, you don't have any political representatives in the Parliament of South Africa today who are crudely, viciously, sort of radically against secrecy for you don't have that. All the parties, and that is where also the issue of party funding comes in, I guess, unfortunately.
Hi, I'm Gabriel. I'm a journalist. Piggybacking off of that, there is this race to the bottom. It makes sense because there's a kind of self-interested logic to any particular player as the general sort of corporate tax rates go down and IFFs go up. It makes more sense for individual players to get ahead in that way. So the one question is politically, what could turn that around? The other question is, if politicians don't get their act together, or the public don't get their act together to guide their politicians and to take this seriously, what does the bottom look like? When do real forces kind of reverse that trend? Just because once you hit rock bottom, you have to bounce. What does that look like?
I'm going to run out of time actually, because if I take more questions or if I take more comments, then our speakers will have an opportunity to sort of have closing remarks. I really appreciate it if maybe we take up some of the issues during tea and continue this conversation. I think it'll be much more better. So I'm just going to close this round. Forgive me, it's not that I don't like you. James and Daniel, please. Yeah.
So I'll respond to the issue of private sector units. I think I'll begin by saying that we began from the place. We began from a place where unions were not much involved and didn't know much. And so we began from doing education, doing training, and awareness creation with public sector unions. And so now what we are doing is we are gradually involving, it's not an easy task, we are gradually involving private sector unions. And like Dick said, we are trying to bring in the discussion the issue of wages, because it is paramount that to get private sector unions into the game or into the fight, we look at the issue of wages, and that is a bit of concern. There's one other aspect of the campaign that we still need to discuss to find solutions to it. So, for example, when Finance Uncovered with some of their investigative journalists worked on MTN and was able to find some, more practices. So, for example, in Nigeria, the government is asking MTN to pay some amount of taxes that they refused to pay some years back. Now, there are MTN workers who are members of a private sector union in Nigeria. So our question is, how do we engage some of these workers without sacrificing them to the employer? Because, for example, when you meet private sector unions, yes, they are involved, they are interested, yes, they like what you are discussing, but the issue is how do you engage them, especially in the process of the campaign. And we think that this is where we can rely on the work of some investigative journalists, we can rely on the civil society organizations that are involved. There is a challenge in bringing civil society organizations and trade unions together to work in the same room. Apart from the issues of structural differences that even limits issues of this, taking decisions and the rest, there are also some political differences. And so, for example, in Kenya, it's difficult to bring a strong union like COTU together to work with the civil society organizations. There are some trade unions in Ghana who have had very, very bad experiences with civil society organizations, some leading to betrayals and the rest. So I think that in that regard, we still have to do a lot more work to ensure that unions and civil society organizations can come together, identify their strengths, and know what each organization can place on the board in terms of the fight. So I think that is what we are, and it's work in progress. It's not easy. We are still working on it. We will ensure that we have enough, private sector unions and all unions on board. The issue of the role of global unions in the global north and the global south. I think that the problem is global. Workers in Australia are facing the same situation. Workers in the US are facing the same situation. In Nigeria, in Ghana, in South Africa, in Kenya, in Tanzania. So I think that we also, even within this context, we also have to rely on the strength of some of the unions. Because, for example, it's difficult for me to, if I'm asked to find some information on some companies in Ghana, it is difficult for me to find.
But if I rely on my colleague who is a worker in Australia, due to how their laws and their systems are and how easy some are able to find information, it's easy for them. So for example, we can work together and rely on their ability to easily find information on a multinational company which is in Australia and operates in Ghana and operates in South Africa and operates in other part of the countries. So and then on another part, we also collaborate with them when we have various conferences and meetings, and as far as our training and education sessions are concerned, we try to engage them and know where each can provide support for ourselves. I think that on that front, that is how I'll put it. And that will lead me to answering how workers are engaged in the campaign. I think that in as much as we believe in the power of workers in bringing a good number of people together to demand for change, I think that we also have to appreciate the limitation of workers in terms of mobilizing and bringing every worker together constantly to campaign. So we can say that let's have workers do what they are supposed to do as workers, bringing workers together, and then let's rely also on some of the capacities of some credible civil society organizations that we are sure, that we are confident, that we trust, and we can work with. I think that this is how we should approach. The other thing is, for example, if Dominic invites a trade union member into this meeting, you are likely to find one who is a trade union staff or one who is a trade union member. The responsibilities or the role each of them can play in the campaign is different. I don't expect a trade union member, for example, who works in MTN to be on the to be leading the campaign. That would be very difficult. But for example, if I'm asking such a person to provide some information on MTN, it becomes easy. So that, for example, we can have a union staff to lead the campaign. We can have some other persons to lead the campaign. That is how I'll develop that. And I think that the issue of trying to get a political or to establish a political front or a divide that will counter, for example, movements like the OECD and their project, which, like Dick said, is failing. I think that we also need to establish very independent institutions and commissions. And I'm not saying that when we establish them, they can win, but I think that it provides a platform where we can have alternative views in terms of how we deal with both national and international corporate taxation. So for me, on my part, these are some of the few issues I was able to capture.
I'm going to stand up because I'm tired of sitting. And I'm too old to sit still for all these hours. I want to thank you for your questions. They're all pretty sharp. I'm not sure I got all of them, but there are a couple themes that I guess we need to emphasize. First of all, this is a political problem. It's not an economic problem. And it's a problem of organizing effectively, not only within your own country, but within other countries as well, because there's similar issues faced by lots of other developing countries. And I think South Africa has sort of a unique opportunity to lead on this issue. It hasn't done so, but on the issue of tax justice, on the issue of law enforcement, on the issue of financial disclosure, on the issue of whether or not we can imagine a world in which there's decreasing inequality and a fairer distribution, and whether we want to spend more resources on developing agriculture, urban blacks want to work in. Most of the land that was redistributed through the existing restitution process, as you know, was leased back to white farmers. People didn't want to go and work on the farms. And they've de-invested in agricultural schools in this country over the last 20 years. it's like they almost said, you know, we need industrialization, we need urban workers, but we're not going to invest in agribusiness. We're not going to have trained people who are capable of going to the farms and working. So that's an alternative, I think, that we need to consider. If somebody steals my house and he creates a value at that house, I have a decision to make. I can go take the house back from him. Or I can say, okay, keep the house and pay me 80, 90% of the revenue that you generate from the house. Because you're managing it well. I mean, I don't really want to be there anymore. So that's an economic issue. It isn't a political issue. It's sort of like, how do we build a country 50 years from now where people are better off? There's more employment, there's more value, and people are feeling like they're treated fairly. And that is a hard problem to solve, but it doesn't, I don't think you throw out the whole tax question as an alternative. That's a tool in the toolkit, and you've got to figure out how to use it. So, now, the world's a nasty place right now. We have the biggest countries in the world, certainly the most powerful, on the wrong side of a lot of issues. My own country, climate change and immigration, and tax justice, financial secrecy is moving in the wrong direction. But we're going to turn that around. There's no time at which this struggle ends, in which we say, okay, we give up. And what we need to do is to have strategies. So in the area here, we talked about a few strategies that we might consider. One is, what is exactly the tax situation in agriculture and mining? These sectors are heavily subsidized, in effect, by the tax system. And there are interests at stake that are behind the scenes, and we're going to have to deal with that. But exposing those interests and actually identifying what the issues are to a greater degree than has been done so far, I think is vital. Secondly, the idea of using the financial secrecy issue in negotiations, in concrete labor negotiations. Say we have to know what you're really up to here. You have to tell us, because we're working in your organization. That's a legitimate demand. And I don't know how often that comes up, but how often is that demand actually made by the unions, in labor and wage negotiations?
It's done, and then they say, what are you implying? Are you implying that we are critical?
Yeah, well, we're not implying anything. What are you afraid of? What are you hiding? The idea of having a strong state that can put people in jail if they're not actually, if they're violating the law is an interesting idea. I mean, I come from a state called Minnesota where we actually put bankers in jail. They go to, if they screw up, they go to jail. It's a strong culture, but it comes out of a lot of experience. And I think having a demand for one of the strong things about South Africa, I think, is has been its court system and its legal system. I think that's one of the reasons I would personally want to invest here, because I believe in the place. I guess that's, we can talk about cryptocurrencies, and some of these other questions are pretty micro, but the overall point about encouraging people to be good citizens and talking about what that means, and demanding more of the professional societies like accountants. It's disgraceful that the law society and the accounting societies and the financial institutions don't have a code of ethics that they have to observe, and it's effective policing. I mean, it should be a demand, I think, on the part. It's a reasonable demand for good citizenship on the part of all these institutions. Anyway, that's enough for me. So we'll talk in other sessions. But thank you very much for letting me be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kia. Okay, so we can break for tea now. We're 5 minutes ahead. So maybe we can come back from tea at 5 to 12.